Path-breaking in her early recording of Holocaust survivors, Dr. Dwork weaves their narratives into the history she writes. Internationally renowned for her scholarship, she's also a leading authority on university education in the field of Holocaust and genocide. Most recently, Dr. Dwork served as the Shapiro Senior Scholar-in-Residence at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We heard from Joanna Wasserman yesterday. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dwork for her lecture, Saints and Liars, American Aid and Rescue Workers in Nazi Europe.
And most important, I'm a great friend and fan of Liz's and of Paul's. This is a most unusual lecture for me to present. Usually, I offer a slice of history. Today, by contrast, I will speak about my current book project to introduce you to historical actors, the American relief and rescue workers. These are the people I am busy with at the moment in my head. These are the people I study. And equally important, to urge you to think about and maybe even to teach history slightly differently than you have before. So, and I will end with snapshots to illustrate my points. So I will speak as per instructions for 42 minutes. And as those of you who have studied together with me before, I always say plus minus 10%, depending upon how often I breathe, or the things I think I just need to tell you right at that moment. That's number one. And number two is you all have handouts. I prepared a handout for everyone to have. And again, number one, do not clutch. There will not be an exam at the end of this talk. That's number one. Number two, most of what is on the handout is not of great historical significance. The point is for you to be able to follow along with me so that when I say words that you may not know, you don't turn to the person next to you and do as I would do and say, what'd she say? You can just look on the sheet and see what I said. The other is that when you are wondering when this woman will ever stop talking, take a look at where we are on the handout, pace yourselves, and we'll get to the end together. Okay, so few of the Americans who hurtled into action on behalf of the victims of the Nazis and their allies are known to us today. The efforts and successes of people like, think about it, do you know Martha and Wait Still Sharp? Hands up, those of you who do know the Sharps. Great. Moses Beckelman, hands up. Yay, good for you. You are so far, it's like, wait, don't tell me, you're winning the prize.
What is the prize?
Another hour of lecture.
I'll take it.
Marjorie McClelland, anybody? Elizabeth and Robert Dexter, Herta and Noel Field. Typically their names elicit hardly a flicker of recognition, not even now when we are in the midst of the greatest refugee crisis we have faced since the Second World War. So my aim number one is to say, who were those intrepid souls who, unlike their fellow citizens, saw possibilities for action when others saw none? This book that I'm working on drills down on what they aimed to accomplish and how they managed these feats. So each chapter drills down on a city, a year, and one person or couple. And if you look on your sheets, you'll see that whole layout, so I don't have to go over it. So the narrative arc, or the narrative, I should say, arcs from one hot spot to the next. When it became impossible to do relief work here, efforts shifted to another place, and then they shifted to another place. So you can see it did not remain constant over time. Zooming in on these concrete situations, Saints and Liars traces the development of initiatives as they unfolded on the ground and in real time. So that's aim number one, just to talk about who these people were and what they did and how they did it. Aim number two, gender looms large here. Women figured prominently in these initiatives. Philanthropy and service were long considered women's work. But this philanthropy and this service offered unimagined avenues for independent action, and the women loved it. They relished the independence, the freedom from social norms that these overseas assignments offered them. And their experiences changed them. Regardless of gender, my Americans, our Americans, emerge as both agents of change on behalf of others and subjects who were shaped by what they saw and what they did. Their work was transformative for the people they helped, but also transformative of themselves. If Saints and Liars plumbs or pays particular attention to the role of gender, it also plumbs the role, and here, drum roll please, it plumbs the role of the irrational. Social historians have traditionally focused on age, gender, social class, degree of religious observance, but they've shied away from the unpredictable, the importance of timing, luck, chance, fortuitous circumstances. Social historians, and I am one, so I can't say they, I have to say we don't know what to do with timing or luck or chance or fortuitous circumstance, and so we just don't do much. So let me give you an example to illustrate my point. Hannah Starkman. Then she's on your list, yes? Hello?
No.
Good.
Hannah Penn Starkman.
Yes, exactly. She was then age 12. She was with her mother and brother Heniek in the German-imposed ghetto in the Polish city of Radom. And now from her oral history. One night we heard shooting. We went to the window and we saw people running and German soldiers shooting. We got dressed, and then a couple of minutes later we heard Germans in the building yelling, "Raus, raus, raus." So we all went out, and there were masses of people in the street. You could go either to the right or to the left when you got into the middle of the street. We stood there for, I don't know, half an hour, and then they told us to go back into the apartment house. We didn't know what happened. We found out later. Radom had two ghettos, a small ghetto on one side of the town and a bigger ghetto where we were on the other side of the town. They sent everybody from the small ghetto to Treblinka annihilation camp that night. They had a few cars, those cattle cars, train cars left. So they needed some more people. So they got all the people from the big ghetto out on the street, and they counted how many people they needed. So some of our neighbors, who, when they left the apartment, went to the right, they were sent to Treblinka that night. And we, because we turned to the left, we were not sent out. The luck of the draw. So later on, when my brother came home from work and my neighbor's son came home, he didn't find his mother and sister. My brother found us. It was just one of those things. I am not minimizing the importance of policy, practice, ideology. Were it not for ideology, policy, and practice, Hannah, her brother, her sister, the other Jews of Rodham would not have been in that situation at all. But at that very moment, fortuitous circumstance shaped her fate. I began to pay attention to what I call these slippery factors. These are less concrete, less measurable, but they are forcefully significant. I began to pay more attention to them while writing Flight from the Reich. But now, with Saints and Liars, and here I come to number 3, which I think is actually the most important piece, I tackle the even messier role of emotions, human relations, the irrational. Our Americans were people, operatives, of improbable courage, resourcefulness, and resilience. They were fueled by principles, to be sure, but they were fueled too by personal and professional ambition, eagerness to actualize their potential, a taste for adventure, frustration with limitations. Social ties and connections counted a lot for them too. Emotions played no small role, as did irrational responses, spurring decisions, triggering their actions. So my aim, number 3, in short, is to take very seriously the factors, emotions, social relations that we know shape our own lives. My God, we know that these shape national politics, but we more or less ignore in our analyses of the past. We are very well aware of the ways in which irrational feelings, our own and those of others, affect us. But we impose a rationality in our analyses of the past. My goal is to prompt us to imagine the past as a time as rich as the present in which we live. In other words, to reframe, reanalyze, and rethink the way we teach and write history. I do not mean to marginalize the factors we know are significant. What I want to do is to add another lens. Clear so far? Okay. So now let me offer some snapshots as to how this works. And just take a moment, just a beat, and think about the way you think about history. When we think about the present, we definitely take emotions and the irrational into consideration. But think about the way you think about the past. I know for myself, I impose a kind of carapace of rationality. I imagine that people in the past acted rationally, took rational decisions. Why should they be any more rational than we? Okay. Prague, 1939. The Munich Pact, and you remember that was September 30th, 1938, and you remember that it gave Sudetenland to Germany without a shot fired. Still, The assault claimed the attention of the American Unitarian Association, headquartered in Boston. Now that is how the Unitarians frame their own, the history of their own service committee. Let's shift the frame. Okay, so they start with the Munich Pact. Oh my God, yes.
One thing you say, Munich Pact, 30 September 1939.
Oh, it should be 38, it's a typo.
38.
It's definitely not 39, thank you so much, it was a typo. Okay, let's shift the frame. Everybody there? Okay, hello? The Germans had marched into Austria half a year earlier. And while the AUA may have been concerned, no one sprang into action. So clearly, Czechoslovakia held a different place in the Unitarian leadership's political imagination and emotional heart than did Austria. In 1938, so what might that be? Why? Why did they just sit around when the Germans marched into Austria, but they sprang into action in Czechoslovakia? So, in 1938, Czechoslovakia was home to a 3,500 person Unitarian community founded by Norbert Kopek, with the main church, wait for this name, Unitaria, in Prague. Kopek's daughter, Bodana, and her husband, Karl Haspel, had graduated from the Pacific Unitarian School of Religion in Berkeley, California. Charlotte Masaryk, the deceased wife of Tomáš Masaryk, the president of Czechoslovakia, was an American Unitarian. In other words, ties of kinship and friendship abounded between the Unitarians in the United States and Czechoslovakia, and these added weight and gravity to the AUA assessment of the situation. I have just listened to the news broadcast from Prague in regard to the Czech crisis. One Howard Matson wrote to AUA President Frederick Elliott. We Unitarians have so many connections with our fellows in Czechoslovakia that we have a special obligation for action. The board agreed and promptly dispatched Robert Dexter, director of the AUA Department of Social Relations, to Europe. Some 200,000 refugees crowded into Prague, of whom 25,000 needed to emigrate immediately, Dexter reported in November. The Unitarian leadership did not dither. They looked for a minister and his wife to bring witness to Prague. According to Waitstill Sharp, 17 men, at that time Unitarian ministers in America were only male. So 17 men and their wives were approached. All declined. Waitstill and Martha were the 18th, and they accepted. They sailed for Europe in February 1939. She was 33, he was 37. They took $41,000 in relief funds to disperse, and they left their 2-year-old daughter, Martha Content, and their 7-year-old son, Hastings, with close family friends. What prompted them to agree? Most particularly, what prompted Martha to defy gender role expectations? What did she imagine she would achieve, and what did they accomplish? That's the cliffhanger. Wait for the book for the answer. pause here for a moment to explore the transformative nature of the rescuers' work on them. Martha's tenure in Prague was but the beginning of a previously unimagined professional trajectory. She was utterly committed to her work. As Wakestill, who hoped she would join him in Switzerland in July 1939, observed, "There's no use making a reservation for us here if you are intending to stay by your beloved refugee cases in Prague." "My darling Wakestill," she replied to her rather irritated husband because she would not join him. "My darling Wakestill," she replied, "I am terribly lonely without you. I think that the experience here has made me realize how much I love you. We need more quiet times together when we aren't really rushed to death by the clock. Somehow, we've got to begin to tell the world where to get off." She didn't, nor did he. August 10, 1940. "We have never separated so completely since we were married," Wakestill lamented. "I fast forward through the war and their work in France and Portugal, their individual decisions to leave the Service Committee for other relief and rescue organizations. I fast forward to the Democratic Party's invitation to Martha to run for a House of Representatives seat in 1946. At that point, Martha was in Massachusetts with the children and often on the road as a key fundraiser for Hadassah and Youth Aliyah. Wakestill had returned to Prague. "I can't see much prospect of rootage with the family in the mad glare and dash of public life," he wrote to her. "Perhaps none of the rest of you three," and by that he meant Martha, and then the two children, Martha Hastings and their son, Hastings and Martha Content. "So perhaps none of the rest of you three want any rootage. But I suspect the two of the three of you do, and want it with thoughts too deep for tears. 7 years ago at this hour, you and I were getting off the train at Wilson Station in Prague, and all our world has been different ever since. I don't believe that you have ever taken in the continuous sinking feeling that beset the parsonage when you were headed outward. It was so real, you could have waited. We finally could not count on any time that you wouldn't be off to a talk or a tea or a committee meeting or across the continent. There have been times out here when I have been almost desperate because of the amount of work to do and the loneliness. I can't touch a woman. I see nothing but men's things in the wardrobe. I smell no perfumes. I see in my mind's eye that hotel room in Lisbon and all your beauty junk on the shelf. It was in the way then. I wish it were in the way now. 7 years ago tonight, we stepped off the train into Wilson Station and into a new world. Their marriage limped on for another 8 years. Martha and Wakestill divorced in 1954. Many husbands and wives divorce, even in 1954. My point is that this particular couple divorced because of the ways in which Martha's experiences had changed her. She had outgrown the role of the minister's wife. Vilna, 1940. In September 1939, and that's no typo, in September 1939, it was clear that Lithuania might become a neutral island in the midst of a spreading sea of war. The JDC, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, with a long record of aid to the 155,000 Lithuanian Jews and to the 85,000 Jews in Vilna and its environs, saw a spot of looming need, and it saw an opportunity for constructive action. European Director Morris Troper detailed the recently hired Moses Beckelman, detailed him to Kaunas. Beckelman arrived in October 1939. Isaac Gitterman, director of the JDC operations in Poland, fled from Warsaw to Vilna and joined his American colleagues soon thereafter. Thousands of Polish Jews were, like Gitterman, eager to reach Lithuania. Seeking to escape the German advance, they fled into the Suwałki district in the hope of slipping across the border. According to a report by Beckelman, there were 15,000 Jews in the district when the Germans annexed it to the Reich and unrolled a new expulsion action at the end of October 1939. Are you with me? Okay. Announcing that Jews were to go to Lithuania and Germans in Lithuania were to come to Suwałki, Nazi authorities, and again now I'm quoting from Beckelman, escorted Jews to the frontier, and when the Lit Guards refused to admit them, they were told to make their own way across the frontier as best they could, but not to return to German Poland under penalty of death. All papers, passports, etc., were taken from them and destroyed. Lithuania was in a bind. Listen to the argument as it unrolls and see whether you think there are any resonances with today. Beckelman quoted Vice Premier Bizauskas' observation that, and now I'm quoting the quote, while Lithuania could perfectly well admit 500 or even 1,000 such refugees, this would simply constitute an invitation to the Germans to send in thousands more, which would swamp the country. Still, several hundred made their way into the country, and according to Beckelman, about 1,000 were scattered at various points along the frontier in no man's land on November 2nd. Asked to send aid, the Lithuanian Red Cross declined on the grounds that these Jews were not Lithuanian citizens. At the same time, the Lithuanian frontier guards refused to allow local Jews to bring food, clothing, or blankets to the refugees in that no man's land. It is impossible to overemphasize the devotion and sacrifice of these small communities, Beckelman wrote. Comparing their activities to an underground railway of the Civil War era, Beckelman explained that the actual work of smuggling refugees over the frontier was carried out by Jewish young people. He admired their dedication. What about his own role? If you read only the reports, you would have what I told you. But now we have more information from his diary. So what about his own role? His diary entry from the next day, November 3rd, Troper called from Geneva. He may come to Kaunas at the end of the week, and I have a notion I'm going to be pulled out of here. I'm keeping my fingers crossed, hoping. And November 8, Katz was a colleague in Lithuania. Katz and I had supper together, and Katz pumped me for all he was worth on my relations with Gitterman. Katz's brother-in-law has apparently buzzed him on the story that Gitterman has been trying to line up Jewish political party support for his proposal to serve as JDC representative for Eastern Europe. Katz thinks that's doing me dirt, but I'm not so sure. I'd be just as well satisfied to be shifted elsewhere. I've about had my belly full of this part of the world, except that I would like to see Moscow before I pull out. And I'm beginning to feel more and more that this will turn out to have been the junior prom for which I was waiting. And when I get back to the States, I'll be ready for a cushy administrative berth, a house in the country, and a wife. Kids, I'm still not so sure about. And here we come to the role of contingency. The big news, he wrote the next day, is that Troper can't come to Kaunas. New York won't let him. So Gitterman and I will either meet him in Stockholm or go to Amsterdam. I'll make book that Gitterman will pretend to be sorry, but really he will be pleased. Gitterman and Beckelman traveled to the port of Liepāja, the Latvian port of Liepāja, where they boarded an Estonian ship to Sweden to get to Amsterdam. Germans seized the vessel en route. Beckelman, with his US passport, was eventually released. Gitterman, with his Polish passport, was imprisoned in Germany until March 1940 and then returned to Warsaw, where he resumed his role of attending to the needs of the Jewish population. Gitterman was killed by bullet during the first phase of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in January 1943. And Moses Beckelman too served the Jewish community faithfully and well and unflaggingly. He returned to Vilna, where he remained until February 1941, a lone American in a weak neutral state that was overrun by the Soviets halfway through 1940. So people are complicated. Shanghai, 1941. If I'd been a man, I would have joined the Navy and seen the world, but since I am a woman, I joined the JDC. That's how social worker Laura Margolis explained her own career choice. Margolis' wartime trajectory was marked repeatedly by chance and fortuitous timing. The first woman JDC field agent, Margolis was detailed to Cuba in January 1939 to aid the 5,000 European refugees who had fled to that island from Hitler's Germany. Less than half a year later, she was a key participant in negotiations on behalf of the 900 asylum-seeking St. Louis passengers as that now famous ship neared Havana Harbor in May 1939. Seasoned by her Cuba experience, she accepted an assignment in Shanghai, this is May 1941, to help the 20,000 Jews who had found safety in that city, unique city, that did not require an entry visa. Thus, She was there when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, occupied all of Shanghai. Unlike other American operatives whose relief operations morphed into urgent emigration initiatives, Laura Margolis' work arced in the other direction. She was sent to Shanghai to help with the re-emigration of those European refugees who had found their way to the Chinese city. But the bombing of Pearl Harbor put paid to those efforts. The refugees were trapped in the city under Japanese control, and so was she. Now, rather than identifying countries willing to accept asylum seekers and vessels to ship them out, Margolis shouldered relief work. The refugees faced critically important immediate needs that just stretched into an uncertain future: food, housing, medical care, education. How was Margolis to meet these basic requirements? Our main problem, she wrote in a confidential report to the JDC leadership, was not the Japanese or the occupation of Shanghai. Indeed, while handicaps were numerous, least of all these handicaps were the Japanese. Rather, according to Margolis, the problem rested with the Jews, especially the pre-Nazi era residents. At no time did we have a real choice when it became necessary to appoint leaders and committees. We had to accept the best that Shanghai had to offer. And the best were either men who accepted responsibility because they were forced to by the Japanese, or men with strong power drives. Margolis despised them. Her letters and reports to the JDC office detail her frustration with, and I quote her now, the complete apathy of all local Jewry to the refugee problem, and her frustration with the personalities, character, attitudes, and behavior of the Shanghai Jewish leaders. She had a strong sense of Jewish communal responsibility. Shanghai, she observed, was marked by the absence of a real Jewish community in the Western sense. She was a determined single woman endowed with power as a JDC representative. They were men with traditional ideas about women's roles and traditional ideas about their own importance. And she was a social work professional. In her view, they did not even qualify as amateurs.
Debórah, could you just mention who the pre-war Jewish leadership was?
No, later.
Okay.
And I do it so well.
Who were these pre-war Jewish leaders?
These personal, back to main storyline after that interruption, these personal interactions and emotions hindered the development of relief operations. Yet Margolis persevered, negotiating a complex reality to keep the refugee community alive. And now we come to the last case. So take a deep breath as we plunge forward to Marseille in spring 1942. Are you ready? Okay. The American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, or Quakers, the Quakers, set up their headquarters in Marseille, where they were well situated to support local branches that were serving transit camps in the south of France. It was also well situated to undertake emigration initiatives. The Quakers teamed up with the United States Committee for the Care of European Children, USCOM. Do you see it on your list? Okay. So they teamed up with USCOM to sponsor a group of 100 children to immigrate to the United States. In the meantime, the French Jewish philanthropic organization STAJE managed to obtain the release of a number of youngsters from the transit camps and sheltered them in children's colonies. STAJE officials worried about the oldest of those children. The adolescents on whose behalf we now appeal to you, STAJE workers wrote to their Quaker colleagues, they deserve special attention. According to regulations issued in respect of alien subjects living in France, the child is considered an adult as soon as he or she reaches the age of 15. Even worse, this situation becomes more and more tragic as the child draws near the fatal age of 17, when he may be re-interned in a concentration camp. So whom to help? This problem plagued all rescue workers. Preparing the fourth transport, Marjorie McClelland of the Marseille office reflected upon her calculus of decision-making. It has all to be done in a terrific rush, she wrote to Margaret Frawley in the Home Office in Philadelphia. When your cable came announcing another convoy of 50 children and suggesting that I be given responsibility for selecting the children, it called for some deliberation. I had hoped originally to spend several days in each colony, observing the children at work and play and talking to their teachers. In that way, I had hoped to make some sort of sound evaluation of the children, even though I was not able to give them intelligence tests or make selections on what could really be considered a sound psychological basis. To her regret, Marjorie McClelland had no time for any of this. The realities of my procedure were far different from my plans, because with the necessity for speed, it was necessary for me to make a lightning tour of the colonies, choosing the children after only the most superficial consideration. McClelland set certain criteria. I had in mind two basic considerations: the necessity for emigration and the desirability for immigration of each child. I wished to satisfy myself insofar as it was possible under the circumstances. I wished to satisfy myself of the child's desirability as an immigrant to America, that he was normal, at least averagely intelligent, an adaptable child who would be able to fit into an American family without too much difficulty. But life on the ground in Europe carried weight too. I also took into consideration the situation of the child here in France, for obviously not all cases are similar. I considered the children who had lost one or more parents, children whose parents had remained in Germany or had been deported to Poland, children who were all alone without any family, have less future here, and therefore have greater need for emigration to America than children of families who are all here. Thoughtful and rational as those considerations were, the essentially emotional nature of her decisions courses through McClellan's short biographies of each of the 50 children she selected for that convoy that left Marseille on May 14, 1942. Henri and Miriam Mas, aged 6 and 8 respectively, serve as an example. Polish by nationality, they were born in Antwerp, where their parents owned a small restaurant. The family had fled to the south of France after the Germans had occupied the Low Countries in May 1940. Their father, Samuel, was put to forced labor in January 1941, and the mother, Regina, and children were interned in Rivesaltes. McClellan met them there. Regina Mas, she wrote, seemed like a very nice, simple, earnest woman, very much concerned over her children. I thought it was remarkable that she was so clean in the midst of the camp, where cleanliness is so unbelievably difficult to achieve. Think about it. What if Regina Mas had been a Slav? McClellan sympathized deeply with the victims. She cared about them and was sensitive to the assaults they endured. She worried if she, as she wrote, erred too much in my choices. Still, it fell to her to choose. She applied the rational calculus she laid out for Frawley, yet irrational factors played a role too, sometimes even tipping the scales. At the safe distance of 75 years, we assume that social workers such as Marjorie McClellan relied upon a logical rubric. Her record offers a lens onto the complexity of those choices and decisions. Age, gender, religion, social class, degree of peril, all of these played a role in her selection calculus. But so too did her feelings about and connections to the people who sought her help. So to return to the beginning, it's been my pleasure to introduce you to a few of our Americans. I hope I was able to convey something of the role of gender, as well as how our Americans both shaped and were shaped by their rescue actions. And as you now know, what is most important for me, I hope that, plumbing their record with a fresh eye, I have persuaded you that their actions, the daring do and the daily grind, were shaped by messy and slippery factors as surely as by obdurate local officials, the looming Germans, geography, finances, or the tide of war. So, number one and number two.
My knowledge personally is very limited on this subject, so I might ask a question that's very elementary.
Good for you.
Okay.
Good.
So these rescuers were going over to war-ridden Europe. Now, were they specifically going to help Jewish refugees or any refugees, question one? And what their plan was to bring them back to America and to transfer them to any family that wanted them, or was there a religious connection at all?
Okay, so let me frame this. These most of our Americans went to Europe, number one, some before Europe was at war. So this Prague action was before September 1939, so Europe was not yet at war. And remember, we did not enter the war until Pearl Harbor, so we were not at war. So Americans had greater scope of action than, say, a British person would have, because a British person was already at war in September 1939. These Americans went to Europe initially to offer relief, soup kitchens, medical care, clinics, educational facilities for children in transit camps, to run that kind of basic life-supporting social structure. Is that clear? The situation got worse and worse, but they stayed on, often at risk, if not for their lives, because remember again, America was not yet at war, then certainly they were at risk of harm. Eventually, some also were at risk, at lethal risk. Anyway, back to main storyline. So they moved from relief actions to rescue actions, because the situation also got worse and worse for the people on the ground. In the first instance, the notion was that anyone who was a target of Nazi Germany or its allies was appropriate for help. It quickly became apparent that the vast majority of these people were Jews. That's number one. So the Unitarians went because they felt that their own religious community, Unitaria, was at risk, but they ended up helping numerically more Jews than Czech Unitarians, because there were far more Jews who needed help. Also, and this is like a huge sidebar, another group that needed help were communists, and some social democrats, but surely communists. Now, this posed a problem. Just to give you a little bit of it, Martha, for example, had a lot of contact with communist leaders in Czechoslovakia, communist leaders from other countries who had come to Czechoslovakia after the Nazis had come to power in 1933. She had, as a relief and rescue worker, she had contact with them in Prague. When she ran for office in 1946, guess what her rival accused her of? Yes. So helping that exact group led to an incredibly nasty campaign in 46.
Did she win?
No, she did not win. She did not win. So you were number one, you're number two, you're number three.
Just the second part of the question, when they were then brought to America and given to families, it was just whoever they thought could pay, or were most cultured.
So every organization had a selection committee, and the children actually were not just given to anyone. The families needed to show, in the case of America, the families needed to show that they could support them. In Britain, there was a huge drive to take in children. This is part of the Kindertransport movement, when 10,000 Jewish children came. And there was a huge drive across the whole country with all manner of local selection committees screening people. But although they were screened, it was not the kind of screening that you might imagine for fostering today or adopting today. It was wartime, and wartime situation, and so really, in a way, matters of the heart were not much taken into consideration. So people who offered a spot, who had the place to put the child, the means to keep the child, the house was in a good shape, and so on, they weren't evaluated also for their ability to, in fact, love the child or give the child any kind of affection. It was sort of assumed that anybody who would take the child in would be somebody who would look to its welfare. You're with me? Okay, in both Jews and non-Jews. So Jewish children were sent, some Jewish children were sent to Jewish homes, some Jewish children were sent to non-Jewish homes. Yes, ma'am.
I was just curious, what was your criteria of picking these people? Were there others that you left out?
There are many others that I left out. There's many others.
Because in Vilna, I think even before the JBC stepped in, Rabbi Silver here picked Dr. Samuel Schmidt from Cincinnati to go to Vilna to bring not only money but medical care too. And he spent many months there, and he had a I know I saw that he talked about the letters and so on. His diary was, he wrote a letter to his wife every single day that turned out to be a diary that was published in the Cincinnati Jewish newspaper, so everybody could know what was happening. And he brought, probably the first, he went by himself, and he probably was the American that went there to bring aid. So I just thought.
Thank you. Thank you.
I didn't know if he was part of your original list.
He was not a part of my list. Thank you for telling us about him. And that's exactly, it's a wonderful thing, because as you begin to think about this and you're doing your own reading, the pattern will emerge for you and other people will come to light. So you're number one, you're number two. There was somebody here. Oh, you go first. And then and then number one. Yes.
So you partially answered my question.
Which is?
I wanted to know if there was any Jewish body that accepted those children, if there were Jewish groups. That's one. Number two, I wanted to know how many children do you know were saved in all these operations? And do you have any contact with any one of these kids that maybe wrote a book?
Yes, there are a number of children who certainly have left their testimonies, who have recorded their testimonies. Books I'm not so sure about, because I do not deal so much with the memoir literature as I do with oral histories, but absolutely, my children's pediatrician's wife was such a person. So he's no longer their pediatrician. He's too old. She's too old, and they're too old. Now I think of it. But anyway, so there are a number of children, now adults of course, who have recorded their oral histories. That's number one. Number two, many different Jewish organizations were involved in the rescue of children, in relief and rescue efforts. HIAS is one, JDC is another, and there were local, dotted all over the country, there were local Jewish communities that stepped forward and expressed their willingness to help root a Jewish family or children. Now we go to the one.
The question of the children being placed in Jewish homes or non-Jewish homes and reclaiming them. I remember in the Netherlands there was some issues of getting them back.
Right.
Number two, were there any reports of abuse that you would have recognized in those times that children may have pulled it down, but that
So the question is about the reception of the children in these homes. Number one, about the return of the children after the war, and number two, about the second part of the question is about abuse, about situation. Absolutely. No doubt about it. There were instances, as you would imagine. Number one, child abuse is a fact of life. I mean, not everywhere all the time. It's just, it is a fact. And this particular group was at greater risk. There were no people to whom they could report these problems. They didn't have the language, and they also had no sense, even a greater sense of insecurity as to what would happen to them if they reported these problems. So, so yes, there were, as there were, just by the way, as long as we're on the subject, as there were instances of abuse of children in hiding in Europe. So that's number one. Number two, reclaiming. Different organizations thought through the return of children differently. So the Unitarians, for example, had parents sign that they were giving up their children into the care of the Unitarians, and that the Unitarians would bear the cost of the return of the children after the war. This was in part for the parents, but it was also in part for the American government, who felt much more comfortable about taking these refugees in if they knew that they were going to be leaving after. So that's number one. Number two is that then when the war actually was over, the problem was finding the families. So it's not the same situation as the Netherlands, because there's the whole Atlantic Ocean in between, which made it even more difficult for any surviving parent to find a child. But on the flip side, here in America, as in England, proper registers were kept of where the children were and with whom. Whereas in the Netherlands, with children who were hiding, there were no such registers. I'm sorry, you can't double dip.
This should be the last question.
Oh, sorry.
There's one here.
I've seen that there are any Catholic organizations on this list. Do you attach any significance to that?
I attach great significance to that, and as Kiara would testify, as I served, as you heard before, as the Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence at the Holocaust Museum, where I had the great happiness to get to know Kiara. But one of the things that I said up and down the corridors is, where are the Catholics? Where are the Catholics? And is it Julia, who's the new person who comes in and works on the Catholic Church, right? So I was speaking to this young woman scholar who works on the Catholic Church during the war, and I said, where are the Catholics, Julia? Please send me to the Catholics. They give money. They do give money. They give money to the Unitarians, for example. They give money. But I just don't see them operating on the ground. And she said, no, you won't find them operating on the ground, because the Catholic hierarchy is really about the Catholic Church. It's not about this kind of service committee. Service work is done on a parish basis. So the whole structure of the Catholic Church mitigates against this. So the answer is, I'm looking for them, and the moment I find them, I'll scoop them up. That's in Europe. And what we're talking about are these rescue initiatives.
That why?
Oh, so the two different issues. One is, as I understood the question to be, American Catholics, just like we have American Unitarians, American Quakers, American Jews, American Catholics who went with a service committee as a Catholic service committee, part of a Catholic service committee to Europe. That was the question, was it? Right? So as I say, I'm looking for them. On the ground, in Europe, as you remind us, Catholics certainly were involved in rescue initiatives. Jews, as you know, some Jews found safe harbor in convents, in monasteries, across Europe. So when I say I'm looking for the Catholics, I don't mean I'm looking for the European Catholics or their work on the ground. I'm looking for American Catholic service organizations that went to Europe to help.